Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Isaac Zablocki. I'm Director of Film Programs at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan, and we are very excited to be including you in a very special Q&A for Misha and the Wolves, which is about to be released on Netflix, and we're honored to have it with us just before it goes on to billions of people. And we have here the producer of the film, Poppy Dixon, one of the producers. Poppy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Isaac. Nice to be here. Well, here in my home office in London.
Feels like you're right here with us. And the audience, of course, has seen the movie already. Folks, if you haven't, just so you know, there will be spoilers. We will be talking about the twists and the turns that this movie takes. And I want to start maybe from the very beginning. And Poppy, tell us a little bit about where this all started from and why you wanted to make this film.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, the film started with Sam Hobkinson, the director, who he actually read an article in a British newspaper, just a very tiny little article about a court case that was wrapping up or that was actually ongoing, going on for many years. And it just intrigued him. So he went and searched around that story and started to read the backstory and learn about Misha's story, about the deception, about the situation with Jane Daniel, and just started to think, this would make an extraordinary film. And he got it with Sam, and I had worked together before. I was actually living in New York at the time, and I was just about to move back to London. This was late 2015, early 2016, so quite a while ago. And he sort of told me the story, and I just thought, this is brilliant. This is a layered story that has lots of questions sort of embedded in it. It's kind of a psychological thriller. It's not a black and white picture, which I love with stories. And so he got me on board to produce it. And before I left New York to move back to London, I went and sort of tracked down Misha to sort of try and talk to her and sort of begin that process of meeting people and trying to work out who we could get to tell their part of this story.
And speaking of tracking down Misha, so how close did you get? It seemed like in the film, either you almost had her, or were trying to tell us that you almost had her to tell her part of the story, because we see the setup for an interview, but actually no interview after all.
Yeah, it's do you know what, it was an interesting thing, because Sam always had the idea of, and again, this is a spoiler, so if anyone happens to be watching this who hasn't seen it, then stop right now. But Sam actually always had the idea of using an actress for the first sort of third of the film, half of the film, to tell Misha's story, because he thought that twist, that reveal, would be such a clever play on the notion of, storytelling and deception and kind of, allowing the audience to be deceived in the way that everyone else was who read the story and got swept up in it. And the idea was, if we did get Misha to talk to us on camera, that the second half of the film would be her, or she would appear at least in the rest of it. And I met with her many years ago, and then we spoke to her a number of times over the years, and kept her on board. And there was a moment when we thought that she would take part, but she ultimately she chose not to. She's actually not particularly well at this point, and she, to be honest, she had sort of various conditions around her participation, which would make it impossible for us to actually tell the story honestly and truly. And she is quite sort of fixated on a specific part of it and her relationship with animals, and really didn't want to go into the deception at all. And it felt like the story would be the filmmaking would be too hamstrung actually by that. And it was all already very much in the public domain. There'd been numerous articles, there'd been a Belgian documentary, there'd been sort of bits and pieces which you see towards the end of the film where she has appeared. So we knew we could tell the story sort of, with or without her sort of actual physical participation in it.
Has she seen the film?
She hasn't. No, we offered to show it to her before Sundance, actually, but she's at this point chosen not to.
And since you knew so much already and had done some research before making the film, what did you learn in the process? Were there things that you didn't know that the story really unravels and takes twists and turns? Was that something you knew coming in, like all those twists and turns were there?
I mean, it's interesting because this is very much a past tense sort of retrospective story, isn't it? So it's not an observational doc where we were filming fly on the wall for many years. So we did, coming into it, most of it took place in the 90s, the 2000s, and obviously in World War II. And so we did know a lot. We knew most of the story, but we didn't know who would tell it and what they would say today, 10 years on, 20 years on, or depending on sort of where in that story they fit in. So the kind of the nuances about their feelings and the sort of way they reflect on it. So that's sort of something we uncovered. And then I guess one of the other things that was a bit of a surprise to us, but a wonderful surprise, was how important a role Evelyn Handel would play, the wonderful woman who was herself a hidden child during the war. And she, we knew she was fairly central in uncovering Misha's lie and finding out the sort of the kind of smoking gun of sort of who Misha really was. But it also, I guess the film contains, a couple of quite complex characters, you could say unreliable narrators to some extent, and a story which turns out to be a lie. And then you have this incredible woman, Evelyn, who is an authentic survivor of the Holocaust and who speaks from the heart, and who actually really went on a journey through the making of the film, through the time we spent with her, filming with her and telling her story. She went through a kind of catharsis and a real sort of journey in telling it. And I think that sort of shows, and she kind of becomes the heart and soul of the film. So, that was a bit of a happy revelation for us, because I think without her, it wouldn't have had that, that sort of heart and soul. And sadly, I want to say this because I think it honors her memory, but sadly Evelyn passed away a few months ago. We became very close to her and learned earlier this year that she'd been diagnosed with cancer, and a few months later she was gone. So that was, deeply, deeply sad to discover. But I also felt, really glad that we were able to include her in the film, and for her to tell this bit of her story and have that, as part of the big legacy that she leaves behind.
Yeah, I think she plays a very important part in the film, because when you're telling the story of, and again, spoilers here, of a survivor whose story is not true, there's obviously a danger in that, in a world where unfortunately some people might deny the survivors' stories. And by making sure that there's a balance with a story that is true, you're kind of, making sure that you've presented the film in a safe way. Was that something that you considered at all, as far as presenting the story about someone who's they're basically have manipulated a really tragic event for their own benefit?
Well, it was really important to us, and because there is, that there will be people, I'm sure. I mean, I hope not too many, but there will always be people who say, by telling the story of a fraudulent Holocaust story, you're fueling the fire of Holocaust deniers who might say, if this story isn't true, how do we know, which other stories are true? But, the way I'd look at that is, well, firstly, that's absolute rubbish. That anyone who denies the Holocaust has got a screw loose, as we say in Britain. But
that's also, a nice way of saying it.
but also, yes, we felt we did need a genuine survivor of the Holocaust, and absolutely wonderful that she also was a hidden child, so she had that very exact experience that Misha was claiming to have had. But also, I think there wouldn't be fake Holocaust stories if there wasn't also so many absolutely tragic true stories. So I don't think there's any risk of a story like this. I mean, those deniers will always be there and find things to latch onto, whether those things are true or not. So yeah.
And I think in some ways it even humanizes more the stories of survivors by knowing that, yes, within I mean, this was bound to happen, within all the stories of survivors. Of course, there'll also be people who took advantage of this situation, and that story is a part of all of this. And I think that adds to the complexities, because I believe that the Holocaust should never be seen just as purely black and white. We need to really understand how this is, how everything, that all the terrible things that happened there were coming out of a place of human beings doing terrible things to other human beings, and that's what makes it relevant. I see film very much as a form of education, and I'm curious because I think films change people and add to people's experience. And I'm wondering why this story was important to tell. What do you hope the audience takes away as lessons from seeing this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and everyone, I think we can learn something from everything we watch, whether documentary or fiction or comedy, even. I think, but we can also just have an experience, which is emotional, or even, dare I say it, it's a word not a lot of people like to use in documentary, but entertaining as well, and I think a documentary can be all of these things in one. And I think this story, I mean, ultimately we're in a time where the value of truth is being challenged and pulled apart, and there are some historical truths which I think cannot be challenged and must be told and must be faced, and obviously the horror of the Holocaust is one of these. And so I think that telling stories that kind of explore the kind of cultural legacy of the Holocaust is really important, and I think that that's something that this story does. I also think we're coming to an age where there aren't many survivors left, and it's really important to capture those stories while we still can. So that's sort of a reason why I feel honored that we were able to include Evelyn's story in this, and her reflections, before it was too late. So I think that's something that I think people can sort of take away from this. But I think it sort of challenges you to really consider, why people lie, and why people believe their own lies, and whether they do, and there's sort of the kind of many grey layers within deception and self-deception. I'm ever always fascinated by by those questions, and that's something that I think the film.
I really think it's fascinating. You mentioned within all of that of the unreliable narrators, and we do live at a time where we have a lot of unreliable narrators, and it makes people question what's real and what's not real in our world, what's fiction, what makes something a historic fact, and what makes something an opinion, and it's sometimes very, very subjective. And I think this film really points out those complexities in storytelling. And I'm wondering, within the form, and you mentioned this a little bit before, as far as the plans to include actors, but within the form, as far as approaching this question of reality versus fiction. How did you go about that within the production? Where did you want it? Where did you highlight elements of playing with these themes? Because I felt that this was something that really was at the core of the film.
Yeah, Well, it is a film about storytelling, right? And a
Yeah.
story about deception and fabrication. And so, like I said, Sam came up with the idea of having an actress play Misha very early on in the process. He just thought that that would be a way of the film kind of being, I think he uses the term self-referential. So, we're not shying away from the fact that we are also sort of slightly jumping on the bandwagon of telling this story and revisiting this story that has been sort of twisted and shaped by various people over the years. So yeah, it felt right for there to be a kind of rug pull within the film where the audience it also realizes they've been deceived in the way that everybody else was. And then for that construct, Sam really wanted to film the deconstruction of the set and of the actress's makeup and wig coming off, and the and if you've just seen the film, you'd remember that it hangs on for quite a long time towards the end of the film, where you continue to see this set being deconstructed. And I just think that's a really interesting visual way of depicting the unraveling of a truth, and or the unraveling of a lie, I guess. And I think that that's also played with, in the editing, the music. There's a kind of playfulness throughout the film that I think sort of speaks to all of that.
Yeah, I think it really highlights this cinematic element that comes out from the message of the film, of storytelling. My final question to you is, so the film's coming out on Netflix next week, I believe.
Yes, it's in the US and sort of various things. It's actually coming out in the UK not till later in the year, because we have it on the BBC over here. But yeah, we're excited about the Netflix launch.
Has there been any up until now, and of course premiered at Sundance? Have there been any surprising reactions to the film since its release?
It's a good question, actually. I'm not sure. I mean, generally, it's been incredibly positive. I mean, the reviews have been. I mean, there's always a couple of people who don't get it, or they don't like these kind of slightly tricksy documentaries that play with the form so much. I actually only saw the film for the first time on Saturday night on a big screen. So because of COVID, we weren't able to go to Sundance. We haven't been able to go to any of the other sort of festivals it's been playing at, but it was at Sundance London this past weekend. And it was amazing for us, all of us, the producers and director and everyone hadn't seen it on a big screen. And it was just wonderful to have audience members come up to us afterwards and say how much they'd enjoyed it and how they felt about it and what it made them think and feel. And I loved that. I mean, we were always worried that some people wouldn't get the reveal that Misha was played by an actress, and that wouldn't land. But I think generally people do, and especially, like you say, we make it quite clear at the end that it wasn't just for anybody who wasn't who hadn't quite got it. But I've been pleased by the response, and people really did connect with Evelyn and her story, and that was something that we were really pleased with how that landed as well.
Glad to hear it. I'm sure there'll be many more reactions as this film gets more attention, and we look forward to hearing about your next projects. Thank you so much for being with us today, Poppy.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for screening the film.
Our pleasure, and thank you for making this such a fruitful discussion. Thank you, folks, and please check out jccfilm.org for other upcoming films.